Scientists and political theorists relied on theories of race to order humankind according to psychic and physical expressions, bodily features and structures, blood and shared ancestry, and other observable characteristics. Modern, exclusionary forms of racism began to appear across Europe and its colonial world as a mass phenomenon in the long 19th century. The idea that a hierarchy of humankind could be constructed based on absolute differences formed the essence of modern racism. In Russia, as in other European countries, a science and policy practice of race began to emerge. Following the assassination of his father on March 1, 1881, Tsar Alexander III sought to work out a new political model for Russian autocratic rule. The political conservatism of his reign marked the appearance of an exclusionary racism in all walks of political life in the empire. In the western borderlands, ethnic minorities, including Poles and, to a lesser extent, Ukrainians, suffered as a consequence of the state's reactionary policies. But it was the so-called Jewish problem that took center stage. The figure of the Jew was featured prominently in Russian popular and elite culture. Reactionary journalists circulated images of Jews sucking the blood of Mother Russia and plotting an international conspiracy of domination. On the opposite end of the empire, in the Far Eastern zone, the population that sparked similar apprehensions was the East Asians. The commonalities between anti-Jewish thinking and anti-Asian prejudice were many. Russian officials perceived Chinese and Korean labor migrants as a distinct threat to the development of economic interests. An unusually high percentage of foreigners were hired for their low cost of labor. Russia experimented with an assortment of border control methods, from taxes and permits to passports and population quotas. As in America and other places around the world, the efforts to control the border were fueled by sensational media depictions of cunning, dirty, and deceitful Asian migrants.
Being expressed through a set of semantic differences, the concept of race embraced skin color as the most visible, the most obvious criterion of difference. That said, race continued to code all types of differences, from class to gender to ethnic to civilizational. And because of those, historians have learned to treat race not as a diagnosis, not as an objective measure of anything, but as a language that helps to understand the construction of groupness, the construction of otherness. Historians of the Russian and Soviet imperial formations unfortunately proved to be less receptive to this understanding of race as a language. The Russian Empire has long been portrayed as traditional, as not quite modern, not quite Western. Such a traditionalist dynastic empire, the argument went, did not need race to naturalize relationships of domination and subjugation. Color was also never central to typologies of difference used in the empire. It is true that the Russian imperial regime, until its last decades, refused to rely on race consistently as the main and all-applicable category of difference. Instead, as we know, the regime operated with such categories as mother tongue and socialist state and religious confession. But this does not mean that representatives of the imperial state were immune to racializing these very categories of groupness. It is also true that leaders of anti-imperial national movements often embraced race as a self-descriptive category, and this is a story that I trace in my most recent books on anti-imperial Jewish nationalism in the Russian Empire. First, such an embrace of race as a self-descriptive category helped to frame the imperial state as archaic, as pre-modern, as a state and political formation that was not natural. and did not need modern scientific categories of groupness to organize and manage the society, something that nowadays historians also do. And second, such an embrace of race allowed these anti-imperial nationalists to disentangle their own group from the imperial mix, and especially to save the culturally Russified elites for their imagined pure national bodies. This was also true about leaders of modern Russian nationalisms, who also perceived the empire as a natural formation, as not quite modern polity, and who saw in the empire an impediment for the development of a strong and pure Russian nation.
After seizing power in October 1917, the Bolshevik Party spent considerable resources promoting its commitment to fighting racial oppression in global affairs. As the doctrines of white solidarity swept the globe, from South Africa to North America and Australasia, Communist Russia emerged as the most hopeful nation on earth for its commitment to racial equality and human rights. In its support of a far-ranging anti-racist agenda, the Soviet Union occupied a conspicuous place in the international arena. Soviet visuals served as an important tool to educate citizens at home in the value of anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and gender equality. The image of the conscious, revolutionary black worker became a common protagonist in posters, films, paintings, and the mass circulation press. Soviet racial enlightenment inspired dozens of black Americans to make the transatlantic pilgrimage to the Soviet Union. Their numbers steadily increased in the late 1920s. They came as active participants in the shaping of the new Soviet regime. W.E.B. Du Bois declared that Soviet Russia was the only modern country where people are not more or less taught and encouraged to despise and look down on some group or race. Ultimately, the promises of constructing a post-racial order proved challenging to carry out. Soviet racial scorn, it turned out, was directed not at black visitors, the face of global racial injustice, but at fellow citizens in its own backyard.
The accepted view was that the Bolsheviks operated with social rather than biological categories of difference. All of this explains why historians of the Russian and Soviet imperial formations never developed a serious interest in race. Again, race not as an abstract diagnosis, not as some kind of measure of the degree of modernity of Westerners, but race as a language that exposed a particular construction of belonging and exclusion. For example, with regard to the Soviet period, what was missed due to such indifference toward race was the construction of class as a race. Class as based on origin, and hence the well-known concept of class origin. Class is inherited as a stigma or a privilege, and hence many examples of children of representatives of former exploitative classes who were disenfranchised by the Soviet regime, who were persecuted, arrested. And class as defining the entire social and political persona of an individual as reflective of generic attribute of the group. So making sense of race as a language of difference in the Russian and Soviet imperial formations, in the post-Soviet presence, is very important, not only from the point of view of understanding the region, but also as a contribution to the ongoing discussions about race that since the end of Second World War has been expressed through cultural rather than biological idioms.
The Bolsheviks took over an expansive land and a multi-ethnic and a multilingual population. By 1922, the Bolshevik Party succeeded in consolidating much of the former empire into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The northwestern borderlands, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and sections of the southwestern borderlands would bear the brunt of the state-sponsored paranoia, targeting presumed foreign collaborators and alleged threats to state security. The internal passport, introduced officially in December 1932, became the single most powerful tool for ascribing nationality. Passports proved particularly useful for carrying out police sweeps. Despite formally rejecting biological paradigms, the Soviet Union reproduced the structures and practices of race in surprising ways. As Joseph Stalin consolidated political power in the late 1920s, ethnic hostility gradually replaced class enemy antagonism. The Soviet Union's racist ideas and policies played out most forcefully in the geopolitically sensitive border zones. In 1928, officials were determined to cleanse all unreliable ethnic and national groups from its borders. By 1938, the operations targeted around 800,000 politically unreliable elements for forcible deportation. In the western borderlands, diaspora nationalities with strong cross-border ties, Germans, Finns, Poles, Estonians, Latvians, were targeted for ethnic purification. Similar mass terror campaigns, defined largely in ethnic terms, played out along the eastern and southern border zones. At the height of the war, in the summer of 1942, Soviet leadership turned its attention to the southern periphery, a region with a predominantly Muslim population that had long been perceived as a security threat. By 1944, the Soviets resettled approximately 500,000 Chechens and Ingush from the North Caucasus in Central Asia. Anti-Semitism created obstacles for Jews in their everyday life. Unofficial quotas for Jewish students in law, medicine, and culture and the arts added to the daily frustrations. Blackness, a marker of foreignness and exoticism, if not alienation, increasingly occupied a conspicuous place in Soviet society. In the 1960s and 1970s, tens of thousands of Soviet citizens from the Caucasus and Central Asia traveled long distances to Moscow and Leningrad in search of new educational and economic opportunities. The migrants earned modest salaries in service and construction sectors and sold their wares on street corners and at bus and metro stations, where they were often called black monkeys, negri, black snouts, and a litany of other racially insensitive insults ascribed to their hair or skin color. By the time the USSR collapsed, the boundaries between Russians and dark-skinned populations began to harden. This development had long-term implications for everyday ethnic relations, which took an increasingly sinister turn in the 1990s and beyond. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, violence directed at Chechens, Jews, Africans, Central Asians, and Roma surged. A crude, paranoid anti-Semitism resurfaced. This ethnic violence decreased in the 2010s, following rising state pressure and repression, but racial issues, often framed under the ethnic, or ethnos in Russian, label, have remained a feature of Russian society.